thank you for that very warm, generous introduction. And I think if I was Jason Bourne, I probably would have abseiled into this room from a helicopter or something. And as for Florence Nightingale, I'll leave that to your imagination. For me personally, it has been an incredible journey. When I was 17, in 1969, and first realised I was gay, I was growing up in the city of Melbourne, Australia, where there were no gay organisations, no campaign groups, no counselling services, no helplines, nothing. All that I had was the prospect of several years' imprisonment for consenting adult same-sex behaviour, and the prospect of being incarcerated in a psychiatric hospital and subjected to forced psychiatric treatment to cure my homosexuality. For a 17-year-old, that was quite scary. But I wasn't deterred. I was determined to try and do something. I felt outraged that the law and society treated me and other LGBT people in this way. So, in the absence of any other organisations or campaign groups, all I could do was write letters to newspapers, challenging homophobic reporting or making the case for the decriminalisation of homosexuality and the enactment of laws to protect our community against discrimination. But I've got to say that initially I didn't dare sign my name, let alone give my address. So these letters were anonymous. And then over the following months, I gradually summoned up the courage to sign my name and even eventually to give my address, half expecting policemen to knock on the door. It never happened, but it could have, and most of my friends thought I was absolutely crazy. They said, go away, you're 17 years old, what do you know, you'll get us all arrested, shut up, keep your head down, that's the way it's always been. To which my response was, that is the way it's always been, but it's not the way it should be. So much of my early inspiration was from the Black Civil Rights Movement in the United States. Those were the nightly TV bulletins I saw, those brave, heroic struggles to desegregate lunch counters, beaches, buses and trains. And I looked at the model of the Black Civil Rights Movement. And I remember at 17 thinking to myself, yes, black people are an oppressed minority. And so are we. Gay people are an oppressed minority just like black people. And we have the same claim to equality and justice. So that was my mind frame or reference point. And then further looking at the experience of the Black Civil Rights Movement, I thought, well, given all the years they took to end the restrictions on black voting rights in the Deep South and to end segregation, it would probably take LGBT people about 50 years to win legal equality in Western countries like Australia, the United States, Britain, and so on. So I was in it for the long haul. I thought, hopefully before I die, I will see this. But I knew it would not be easy. Again, I looked at the experience of the Black Civil Rights Movement and read those reports about the incredible rebuffs and setbacks they had in the early days. The fact that the successive presidents and Congresses refused point blank to act against racial discrimination. And I calculated we would probably experience the same kind of obstruction. When I came to Britain at the age of 19 in 1971, the Gay Liberation Front had just been established. This was a watershed moment in LGBT history. There had been earlier homosexual law reform campaigns, which were very brave and laudable, but largely conducted by men and women who were closeted about their own homosexuality, and very much limited to law reform as it affected gay and bisexual men, not dealing with lesbian, bisexual, or transgender issues in totality. the Gay Liberation Front, first of all, rewrote the agenda. We said this has to be about lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. All these issues have to be tackled. We also need to go beyond law reform to look at laws to protect us against discrimination and hate crime, to equalise the age of consent, to ensure the right, particularly in those days, of lesbian mothers to keep their kids and not lose them in divorce cases when custody was usually granted against lesbian mothers to often very unsuitable straight fathers because judges said lesbian mothers were unfit. We also, in that period, very much saw gender non-conformity as the linchpin that was the core thing that held back LGBT people. And therefore we saw a common interest with women and in particular trans people. So we were very much of the mindset, one of the reasons, the main reason why we are oppressed is because we as LGBT people don't fit conventional gender expectations and stereotypes. We don't fit the orthodox patterns of masculinity and femininity, of male and female. And in challenging that, we were, if you like, aligning with many of the analyses and expectations and demands of the women's liberation movement, which were also challenging traditional male and female gender roles, the boxes of masculinity and femininity. So our agenda was very much about live and let live, be whoever you want to be, don't allow yourself to be put in a box. That, you know, we have to defend LGBT people because we are being attacked for it, but let's recognize gender fluidity, let's recognize that some people don't fit into those neat boxes, and that's fine. So it was a real revolution in consciousness that went way beyond mere law reform. And in fact, in those early days, I can remember that the words equality hardly passed our lips. Not because we were against equality or didn't think it was important, but because we didn't think it was enough. That mere equality was not itself sufficient. And in retrospect, I think, the way in which in the last 2 decades equality has become the mantra is something of a stepping backwards. Because although equality is important, who wants to be equal in an unjust society? Our agenda was about transforming society, not just for LGBT people, but also for straight people. We said, all the sex-negative attitudes in society don't just impact negatively on LGBT people, they're also bad for straight people. So let's devise a new agenda that can bring LGBT people and straight people together. That we can fight together to change society, not merely win equality with the flawed society that already is. And so we made many different protests and campaigns around issues of sexual choice and freedom, again, challenging gender conformism and those kind of ideas. And I think that although the gains of the last 2 decades in terms of law reform have been tremendously important and have made a really substantial difference to people's lives, it might actually be worthwhile to revisit some of those early ideas. And I think it's a great way in which the trans community in particular is doing that. They're challenging this male-female divide, this masculine versus feminine, the idea that biology is destiny. It's not destiny. We create our culture. We create a system of equal rights and non-discrimination. So having said that, I do pay great tribute to the many thousands of LGBT people and our straight friends and allies who have championed the causes we've won in the last 2 decades. Actually, it's less than 2 decades, really. The first major law reform was in 1999, when for the first time the ban on LGBT people in the armed forces was lifted. That was the first major discrimination to go. Thankfully, as we're discussing publicly now the future with the European Union and so on, it wasn't directly as a result of the European Union, but it was directly as a result of the European Court of Human Rights and the Council of Europe, which ruled that Britain's ban on LGBT service personnel was unlawful, unjust discrimination. And they followed up a couple of years later with a similar ruling against the unequal age of consent, saying to have a discriminatory age for gay and bisexual men was unjust, lawful discrimination. So those are two very important early reforms that were brought about because we are part of Europe. But let's just go back to 1999 and think for a moment. In that year, Britain had by volume the largest number of anti-gay laws of any country in the world. Some of them dating back centuries. So you've all heard of the trial of Oscar Wilde in 1895, jailed, 2 years hard labour for consenting adult same-sex relations. That law, the so-called gross indecency law, was originally passed in 1885, and it was only finally repealed in 2003. The same with the law against anal sex. It was passed in the reign of Henry VIII in 1533 and was only repealed 13 years ago. A lot of people are under the mistaken impression that the 1967 Sexual Offences Act decriminalised or legalised homosexuality. Well, first of all, it only applied to sex between men, and secondly, it was a very partial, limited decriminalisation. It only applied to England and Wales. It wasn't extended to Scotland until 1980, and not to Northern Ireland until 1982. Again, as a result of a legal case brought in the European Court of Human Rights, not initiated by the British government. Most aspects of gay male life remain criminalised, despite the 1967 reforms. And in fact, in some cases, it got worse. The maximum penalties in 1967 rose from 2 years for gross indecency to 5 years in certain circumstances. And in the 4 years after the 1967 Act, the number of convictions of gay and bisexual men increased by 400%. The state responded to that limited liberalisation with ever greater repression. And it continued, so that in 1989, the number of gay and bisexual men convicted of the consenting offence of gross indecency, the same law that was used to jail Oscar Wilde in 1895, and gross indecency simply means any sexual contact between men, kissing, touching, caressing, mutual masturbation, oral sex, anything other than anal sex. That law resulted in 1989 in over 2,000 convictions, which is almost as much as in 1954-55 at the height of the anti-gay witch hunts, in a period when male homosexuality was totally illegal in all circumstances. And that escalation in conviction rates, and that was just one of several offences. If you add them all up, the real figure was probably 3,000 or more convictions for 1989. But those convictions were as a result of a number of factors. First of all, the Conservative government in the 1980s had two major campaigns which, among other things, targeted the LGBT community. The first was Margaret Thatcher's Victorian Values campaign, where she extolled the values of Victorian Britain and said we had to return as a country to the Victorian system of morality, which of course totally decriminalised and persecuted LGBT people. And then her subsequent family values campaign, which again reiterated a similar agenda, and culminated in the Prime Minister of this country at the 1987 Conservative Party conference saying, "People claim the right to be gay, there is no such right." The Prime Minister of our country attacked explicitly the right to be gay in 1987 at that Tory party conference. And added into the mix of that was all the panic and hysteria around HIV and AIDS, which was in those days dubbed the gay plague. And gay people were demonised. I had two friends who went to their local pub because they were known to be gay. Initially they were refused service, then they were told to go away and bring their own glasses to be served. There were cases of gay men convicted for offences like shoplifting who had to wear full body suits in court to cover their face and all their body lest they infect the court with AIDS. I mean, this is a monstrous period of demonisation and scapegoating. So that was the context in which you had these escalating arrest and conviction rates. And then, of course, in Manchester, we had the Chief Constable describing gay men as, quote, swirling around in a cesspit of their own making, and organising raids on gay bars and clubs. Dozens of gay men arrested for dancing together in a gay club in the 1980s. Unbelievable. Not having sex, just dancing together. So there's the context, and it just shows how far we've come. It's ghastly what happened, but boy, look at now. Look at now. And of course, since 1999, starting with the end of the ban on LGBT people in the armed forces and the equalisation of age of consent, then we had the repeal of Section 28, fostering and adoption rights for same-sex couples and parents, the first legislation to protect LGBT people against discrimination in employment, later on in goods and services, housing, education, and so on. Then we also had, of course, the legislation for civil partnerships, and more recently, same-sex marriage. It's been a phenomenal, extraordinary pace of change. In fact, I would say it is the fastest, most successful law reform campaign in British history. Never at any other point in the history of this country have so many laws been repealed in such a short space of time. So that is a great tribute to people like yourselves and many, many others, including our much valued straight friends and allies, who've campaigned and championed. And many of those people are completely unknown. But without their grassroots efforts in their local communities, lobbying their members of parliament, lobbying their local councillors, writing letters to the Prime Minister, without their collective effort, we would not be where we are today. So the lesson of that experience is we together are strong. And we have literally moved legal and attitudinal mountains. When you think about it, in the late 70s, early 80s, public opinion was shifting in favour of LGBT rights and equality. And then with that escalation of Victorian Values Campaign, the Family Values Campaign, the AIDS panic and so on, all that went into reverse. So that by the 1988-87 period, public attitudes had swung back the other way. 2/3 of British people believed that homosexuality was mostly or always wrong. And that led to a huge spike in gay bashing attacks and murders. From 1986 to 1991, I identified 51 cases where gay or bisexual women were murdered in circumstances that almost definitely pointed to a homophobic motive. And those were just the ones that were drawn to my attention. I didn't trawl through every single local newspaper around the country. There were probably many others I'd never heard of. But 51 in the space of 6 years. 5 years. That was on a par with the level of racist attacks and murders. Yet, it was almost impossible to get any media coverage. I can remember going to a liberal paper like The Guardian, providing all the evidence and documentation. And The Guardian turned around to me and say, no, not really for us. We're very busy, we've got lots of stories, it's not really for us. I mean, this was profoundly shocking that the country's main liberal newspaper effectively dismissed and declined to cover in any serious way the massive scale of homophobic, biphobic and transphobic murders, let alone the hundreds, the thousands of other lesser violent attacks that were taking place. If those 51 killed is a fragment of the thousands who were actually violently, physically assaulted, and often in many cases left with permanent injuries, including disability. So you can imagine what an uphill battle it was. In the 1980s, I worked with mostly Labour MPs, because I was in the Labour Party at the time, to try and get the government to give the information. How many LGBT people were being physically, violently assaulted each year? How many were being murdered? How many were being arrested? How many were being sacked from their jobs? How many were being evicted from their housing? The government of the day would not answer. They made all kinds of excuses, they delayed giving responses. Those MPs had to go back and back and back again to get figures, and even then they were incomplete. In the battle to decriminalise or end the ban on LGBT people in the armed forces, so Labour MP Gavin Strang led that campaign. I did some research and helped get him some basic facts, but we knew it was only partial. And I remember him going back to government ministers time and time again, will you please tell us how many LGBT people were evicted from the armed forces in each of the last 3 years? The government would just stonewall. It didn't want to give the figures. It was only Gavin Strang's persistence that finally got that information out of the government. And we were astonished to learn that it wasn't just 20 or 30, but it was 100 plus most years, sometimes even 200. And not only were they dismissed from the armed forces, often they were jailed as well. So they lost their job, they were imprisoned, they lost their pension, their home because they lived on a military base. It was totally and utterly devastating. So that's the backstory. But as I said, we have made phenomenal, fantastic progress. That progress should not be underestimated, but nor should it lead us to be complacent, because there are still issues that remain unresolved. We now have same-sex marriage, but it's not equal marriage. Equal marriage would have been to allow same-sex couples to marry under the 1949 Marriage Act. The 1949 Marriage Act originally, and even today, does not specify that marriage partners have to be male and female. There's no impediment in the 1949 Marriage Act to same-sex marriage. That impediment was only legislated in 1971, when same-sex couples, and in particular trans individuals, tried to marry the person they love, and in a couple of cases did actually succeed in marrying the person they love. The government introduced a special clause to amend the 1949 Marriage Act to state that it shall not apply to same-sex couples. So the ban on same-sex marriage is in fact only a very recent modern invention. Now the government could have simply repealed that clause in the 1970 legislation to enable same-sex couples to marry the person they love under the 1949 Marriage Act on the same basis as their straight friends and families. But instead, it chose to legislate a whole new marriage law, the 2013 Marriage Act, which is for same-sex couples only. So we now have a situation of legal segregation in marriage law, a bit like segregation in the deep south of the United States in the 50s and 60s, or like apartheid in South Africa. They had one law for black people, another law for white people. We have a marriage law for straight couples, the 1949 Marriage Act, and another marriage law, the 2013 Marriage Act, for LGBT couples. That is not equality. Separate is not equal. And as you know, that legislation embodies two major discriminations. First of all, the trans spousal veto, whereby a trans person who's married to their partner has to get their partner's permission before they can get a gender recognition certificate. Nothing else comparable exists in any legislation where one marriage partner has to get the other partner's permission. Not for major surgery, not for overseas travel, whatever. This only uniquely applies to a trans person in a marriage. They can't get a gender recognition certificate as a trans person unless their partner agrees. The other major discrimination is, of course, in pension inheritance. If you're in a marriage under the 1949 Marriage Act and your partner dies, this is a straight marriage under the 1949 Act and your partner dies, if you have been contributing to your pension since 1960, when you die, your partner will in most circumstances be able to inherit all your pension contributions going back to 1960. But if you're in a same-sex civil partnership or a same-sex marriage under the 2013 Act, by law, you can only inherit your deceased partner's pension from 2005, or in some cases 1988, but definitely not back to 1960. So you lose massively that pension inheritance. So that's a big discrimination that exists under legislation. Just briefly, a few other issues that remain unresolved. All our fantastic equality laws, and we do have some really fantastic equality laws, such as the Equality Act 2010, which for the first time harmonized all the different equality laws into one comprehensive, uniform structure, rather than having an uneven patchwork of different laws governing race, gender, disability, religion and belief, sexual orientation, and gender identity. We now have them all within one single legal framework. Great. The downside is that written into these equality laws are certain qualified, albeit fairly narrow, exemptions for religious organizations. Not just places of worship, but faith-run schools, hospitals, nursing homes, and shelters for the homeless. They are all allowed to discriminate in both employment and service provision if they can demonstrate that it's necessary for the maintenance of their, quote, religious ethos. Now, I don't want to compel people of faith to support same-sex relations or marriages, but I don't think they should be above the law. I don't think they should be exempt from the laws that apply to everybody else. Every other social institution has to comply to those equality laws to protect us against discrimination. But religious bodies have an opt-out. And I think that has to close. You know, I don't want to compel them to accept us equally within their own particular organisation, although I wish they would. But certainly if they're providing a public service, such as a nursing home for ill and invalid people, they should not be allowed to discriminate in hiring and firing LGBT staff or accepting LGBT clients. That's wrong. Other issues include the fact that even today, about half of all young LGBT kids are bullied at school. Sometimes it's just name-calling and teasing, although that can be quite damaging psychologically. But often it includes threats, menaces, and actual physical violence, where young kids at school, because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, live in fear. That's why the rates of truanting are much higher among LGBT kids. The rates of academic performance are lower. The career prospects for those kids are also severely diminished. And even today, nearly half of all schools don't have an anti-bullying program that specifically addresses LGBT bullying. And the worst offenders, faith schools. Another big issue is, of course, the levels of anti-LGBT hate crime. A third of all LGBT people in this country have been a victim of hate crime at some point in their lives relating to their sexual orientation or gender identity. That's almost 1 million people. And again, many of them have been victims of actual physical violence. Now, murders are fairly rare these days. Thankfully, society has moved on. But actual physical assaults, well, you read about them almost every week. Somewhere around the country, someone coming or going from their home, coming or going from a gay club or gay bar, gets attacked and beaten up. There have been 2 or 3 in the last week and a half in different parts of the country, including in London, which is supposed to be the great liberal capital of this country. So quite clearly we've got work to do there. And my view is that one of the solutions would be, first of all, to have something what I call equality and diversity lessons in schools. That is, a specific part of the national curriculum, mandatory for all schools, where on a regular basis, from the very first year of primary school through to a child's later secondary years, there should be equality and diversity lessons to tackle all forms of prejudice. Racism, disableism, anti-Muslim prejudice, anti-Jewish prejudice, prejudice against LGBT people, prejudice against black and ethnic minorities. The reason I say that is because we know no child is born bigoted. A child isn't born bigoted, they become bigoted because, or some of them become bigoted, because of the negative bigoted influences of adults around them, parents, family members, or from other young kids. And where these kind of lessons have been trialled, the levels of prejudice go way, way down, and those young people grow up to be more mature, accepting adults. They don't harbour those prejudices. They understand people who are different from them. And that makes for a more cohesive, kinder, gentler society. So my question is, why have successive governments, both Labour and Conservative, failed to take that initiative, when all the evidence shows those lessons would really make a difference? Another issue is, of course, the unequal interpretation of the law. It's great to have good laws to protect LGBT people, but what about how they're interpreted and enforced? Just to give you a couple of examples. About 10 years or so ago, a Muslim extremist cleric, Sheikh Abdullah al-Faisal, preached that the Hindu and Jewish people should be killed. He said they were infidels who deserved to die. He incited followers to kill Jews and Hindus. He was promptly arrested, put on trial, and jailed for 9 years. Around the same time, another Islamist cleric, Abdul Muhid, said almost identical things, only he said, kill homosexuals. Homosexuality is against Islam, those people are infidels, they should be killed. Despite 4 witnesses, he was never even taken to court. You've probably all heard of the 8 Jamaican reggae and dancehall singers, like Buju Banton, Elephant Man, Vibes Cartel and others, who put out tracks openly encouraging and inciting and glorifying the killing of LGBT people. Their songs variously say, shoot, hang, burn and drown LGBT people. If a white singer was saying this about black people, or an anti-Semite saying it about Jewish people, they'd be arrested like that. And they'd go to prison. These singers have been allowed to perform openly in this country for years. They've never been prosecuted. The BBC, funded by the taxpayer, used to play their songs until myself and others campaigned, and it took us several years to get the BBC to stop it. double standards. Another issue is, of course, the ongoing restrictions on gay and bisexual men donating blood. The lifetime ban is gone, but it's now down to a 12-month deferral period. That is way, way, way more than is medically and scientifically justified. With the tests done on blood supplies these days, the deferral period could be reduced to 1 to 3 months, depending on the individual circumstances. All the blood donation service has to do is to get LGBT, gay and bisexual men who are donating blood, to identify themselves and to answer a few additional questions to establish their risk factors. Not all gay and bisexual men are at risk. Some are celibate, some don't do any risky sexual behaviour. In those circumstances, their blood is safe to give. And under the current system, where every donation is tested in 3 different ways, you can be certain that with a 1 to 3 month deferral period, you can identify any infected blood. So the 12-month period is excessive. And of course, in Northern Ireland, there is still a total ban on gay and bisexual men, as there is a total ban on same-sex marriage. The final thing I just mentioned is, of course, the plight of LGBT asylum seekers. As someone who has worked with LGBT asylum seekers for over 20 years, I know firsthand that the asylum system is rigged. It is rigged to fail as many people as possible. For example, the government has cut the legal aid for asylum cases, so no solicitor can possibly prepare a professional asylum application. The money isn't there, there's not enough funding. So for example, if an LGBT person has been jailed or arrested in Nigeria or Uganda, to corroborate their claim, the solicitor would have to get evidence from the police and the prison in their home country. That takes months, and it's quite expensive. The amount of money currently available for LGBT asylum claims, indeed for all asylum claims, is about enough to take a statement, not to get any corroborating evidence. So I was dealing with some while back with a young lesbian who reported that she'd been tortured, kidnapped and tortured. Trying to get the evidence would have been very, very difficult. To get the evidence from her torturers, to get the record to prove the torture, but she had the marks and the trauma, so she needed to see a specialist in assessing torture victims. The trouble is, the waiting list for that, because there's inadequate government funding, is months, if not years. And she was put on what's called fast track, where she had only 2 or 3 weeks to prove her claim. So you get the message in the picture I'm painting. No wonder the vast majority of LGBT asylum claimants fail on their first application. Interestingly, of those who fail, if they've got support from my foundation, or the UK Lesbian and Gay Immigration Group, or No Turning Back, or Asylum Aid, if they get that support, they nearly always win, which proves they had a legitimate, honest claim in the first place. But the system was so rigged against them that they failed. So that is a really, really big problem, because we are dealing with people who have suffered incredible, incredible persecution. Not just threats, either violent threats or threats of imprisonment, but arrest, imprisonment, torture, attempts by mobs to kill them. Some years ago, I was helping a young Ugandan man, I think he was 17 years old. He'd fled to Britain. His family had discovered that he was gay, and they organised a mob to kill him because he had brought shame upon the family. And the mob came to get him. He got badly beaten, but did eventually manage to escape. And he lived, I think, in the jungle for about 4 or 5 days until he was able to escape through back routes to another town. And then get support from LGBT people in the capital, Kampala, and eventually to come to Britain. I could tell that story dozens and dozens and dozens of times. It's truly, truly shocking that in this day and age, LGBT people are suffering these kinds of horrendous experiences. And what is worse, that Britain is not fully honouring its obligations under the Refugee Convention 1951 to help and support and give refuge to those genuine, legitimate refugees. So, in conclusion, we've come a long way, but there's still more work to do. And it's great that we can enjoy the freedoms we have. We should enjoy them. We should celebrate them. But let's not forget the unfinished business, and let's make sure the battle for equality, for human rights, for social justice is fully and completely achieved. Thank you.